Welcome to Mr. Beck Does Your Homework. This is physics homework number 6. This is the introduction. This homework is all about objects in free fall. When an object's in free fall, the only influence on it is the acceleration of gravity. And gravity is always pulling straight down. So gravity accelerates all objects that are falling, if we ignore air resistance, at a rate of 9.8 meters per second squared. Sometimes on Texas they'll tell you 9.81. So the acceleration of gravity is 9.81 meters per second, and since it's straight down we usually write negative. So for all of our problems what we'll do is we'll say down is negative and up is positive. And we will use this for our displacement, for our velocity, for our acceleration. If it winds up going down, it's going to have a negative velocity. If it winds up moving down from where it started, it's going to have a negative displacement. So you got to be careful about negative and positive. We've taken our equations and we have converted them into vertical equations from horizontal equations. So this equation tells me that the height it's at is going to be 1/2 of velocity initial plus final velocity, so that's your average velocity times your time. Here it says my final velocity is my initial velocity plus acceleration times time. That's g. That's gravitational acceleration. So my acceleration is 9.81 meters per second squared, and that's what we call g. It's an acceleration of gravity. Our third equation says says that my position vertically is going to be my initial velocity times time plus 1/2 the acceleration of gravity times time squared. And my fourth equation says my final velocity squared is my initial velocity squared plus twice the acceleration of gravity times the displacement. So these are just y versions of those same old x equations that you have that we used before. But this is specific to what I call the y world, the vertical up and down. So this is just to remember, just to remind you that we're using gravity as our acceleration. Other things you need to know that might help you do some of these problems is your tricks. If you have an object and you toss it straight up, it's going to move up and it's going to slow down, it's going to slow down, it's going to reach some point. That highest point, when it turns around, that's the highest point. And that highest point, the velocity equals 0. Because it's going to go up, it's going to come to rest very briefly, and then it's going to come back down again. So if the highest point velocity is 0, that's a good thing to remember. The other trick, another trick, is when it comes back down and it reaches the ground here, this velocity, if this is my initial velocity, this is my final velocity. My final velocity when it hits the ground, so that's different from the velocity at half the time, here it goes up, comes back down. The velocity when it hits the ground is going to be the opposite of the initial velocity. So same magnitude, but opposite direction. So if this was going up at 72 meters per second, this will be going down at 72 meters per second. This highest point happens at half the total time. 1/2 the total time of flight. So if you know how long it takes to get up to the top, it would take twice as long to get back down to the bottom. So the way up and the way down are symmetrical, so the velocity at the top happens at half the total time of the flight. And the final thing is back down at this point. If it goes up and comes back down, I know that at that point my displacement in the y direction, my vertical displacement, is going to equal 0 when it comes back and gets to the same point that it started. So those are a couple tricks. The velocity is 0 at the highest point. That happens at half the total time of flight. So if you know the half, you can get the whole, or if you know the whole, you can divide by 2 and get the half. And that's if it's up and down to the same point, so if it's on level ground. When it's on level ground, if it goes up at a certain velocity, it'll come back down and reach that same velocity right before it hits the ground. So my final velocity is opposite my initial velocity, and if it goes up and back down, my displacement there will equal 0. So these are going to be your tricks to use when you're doing free fall problems.